Welcome everybody from CAFE, the BU and Harvard Climate and Health Research Coordinating Center. I am Rachel Nethery, and I'm a CAFE team member based at Harvard. Today's seminar is part of our State of the Science seminar series with CAFE, where we invite experts from around the world to talk about what's known about relationships between various climate exposures and health, and identifying kind of remaining gaps in different domains. So today we're going to be discussing the state of the science on green space and health. And we're really fortunate to have Dr. Peter James joining us today for this seminar from UC Davis. Dr. James is an associate professor in the School of Medicine at UC Davis and is the director of the Center for Occupational and Environmental Health. His work investigates the influence of geographic contextual factors, including exposure to nature, the built environment, the food environment, air pollution, light pollution, noise, and socioeconomic factors on health behaviors and chronic disease. And he's particularly a global leader and innovator in green space and health research. Thanks, Dr. James, for joining us. For the audience, if you have questions as Dr. James is presenting, feel free to pop them in the chat, and we're going to do a Q&A session at the end, so we'll try to get to all of those. Thanks again, and please take it away, Dr. James.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. Let me just get my slides up. That look okay? All right, great. So thank you so much for having me, Rachel, and it's good to see some familiar names on the attendees list. So I'll be talking today about the state of science on green space and health. First, just to put some of this work into context, my research is really on how the places in which we live, work, and play influence our health. A lot of this is influenced by, traditional environmental health, but also the eco-social model where, individual choices may drive your health, but also the context in which you live may, play a role in driving your exposure, exposure to air pollution, but also access to healthy food, access to safe and inviting parks and green spaces to play and be active in, and then also how these exposures cut across racial and socioeconomic lines. I'm sure other speakers have talked about this concept at CAFE, but my work also fits into this idea of the exposome, right? This idea of the totality of exposures across the life course. So I specifically focus on the external exposome, right? So this is urban environments, air pollution, climate, noise, traffic, things that Rachel just mentioned, but also green spaces and understanding how these things all work together and not purely reductionist work on just one isolated exposure at a time is really my focus. Also, to put some of this work into context, a lot of my work was based when I was at Harvard for a while. I worked with the Nurses' Health Study cohorts and large prospective cohorts like the Nurses' Health Study, where we have geocoded addresses of participants. We follow them forward and have health outcome data, a lot of covariate data. But the really important thing is that we had their geocoded mailing addresses, so their residential addresses, and we could then layer on different types of spatial exposure. So for instance, fine particulate matter, we have information on temperature, which I'm sure that folks in CAFE have spoken a lot about. We have data on noise, we have data on the built environment and walkability, we have data on wildfires, which again, very relevant to CAFE folks. But I really want to drill down deeper into green spaces here for today's talk. So before I dive in, I like to kind of have my face validity slide, right? This idea of just looking at something like Yosemite, right, might stir something inside us, give us this kind of visceral emotional reaction that, just looking at a picture of nature may be enough to elicit a reaction in us. And this isn't necessarily enough to move the needle for health, right? But it's just to have some validity to this idea that maybe there is something about nature that we as human beings just have evolved to like. And so E.O. Wilson, the biologist, popularized this term biophilia, that we've evolved with nature to have an affinity for nature, right? This is the setting that we evolved in, and this is the setting we are meant to be in, not staring at computer screens all day long in fluorescent lit rooms, right? And maybe it doesn't have to be Yosemite. It could be something like the Arboretum here at UC Davis, or the Esplanade in Boston, right? There's lots of beautiful natural settings that we as human beings may gravitate towards and may influence us in different ways for our health. There are also a number of psychological theories as to how nature may impact health and behavior. One of them is attention restoration theory. This is this idea that living in an urban environment, trying to dodge cars and focus on, intense tasks, taxes our attentional control, right? And something about natural environments can replenish that directed attention. So watching trees sway in the wind. I'm not sure how smooth this is looking on Zoom, but watching these trees sway in the wind might allow us to restore that directed attention and be ready for the next cognitive task. There's also stress recovery theory or stress reduction theory, which is that something about being in nature allows us to recover from stress in beneficial ways and evokes positive affect, right? Again, this is a kind of an evolutionary theory. This is the setting that we were meant to recover from stress in. And so, this is the place where we think about like a sauna or spa, like they're playing nature sounds, right? This is the type of thing that we associate with reducing our stress. There have been some kind of seminal studies on this. There's one from 1984 where they tested this theory by randomizing patients on a recovery room floor to either views of trees or views of a brick wall. And they found that the patients who had views of trees had shorter postoperative hospital stays, fewer negative comments from nurses, requested fewer pain meds, and had fewer complications afterwards. So this was like, in the 1980s, this was kind of an interesting fringe idea, and they tested it with a randomized trial, kind of the highest standard of evidence. There have also been a lot of randomized trials on randomizing participants to either experiences in nature versus urban environments. So kind of flipping a coin and saying walk in a natural space or walk in an urban space, and then measuring outcomes pre and post. And over 50 studies randomizing participants to these different types of exposures, they've shown that viewing nature or being in nature was associated with lower blood pressure, decreased heart rate, lower skin conductance, lower concentration of cortisol, a stress biomarker, and greater parasympathetic nervous activity and lower sympathetic nervous activity. There are also studies on cognitive tests, and people seem to be performing better on cognitive tests after spending time in nature. So this is kind of an acute, like short-term reaction to spending time in nature. Another thing worth noting is that in these studies, they found that comparing exposure to real natural environments, so actually getting people out into nature and testing how that was associated with different outcomes, was stronger than having them look at virtual nature, so looking at pictures of nature. But it is worth noting that there was an effect for virtual natural environments as well. So there may be some benefit, but maybe not as much of a benefit for these shorter term processes, right? But in my research, I'm really more focused on longer term health outcomes. So not these, individualized intervention, short term effects, but really how can we understand how living in a place with more nature might be associated with better long term health outcomes. So the mechanisms that we think about for how nature might influence long-term health outcomes are basically, so this is nature, exposure to nature, contact with nature, and then these kind of four main pathways. So the first one is usually listed as air quality, but I think about it as different environmental factors. So greener spaces may be less likely to have high levels of air pollution. They may be lower levels of noise, and also buffering your exposure to extreme temperatures. And that might have an independent effect on health and well-being. Green spaces may provide a setting for physical activity, and that has strong connections to health and well-being. Green spaces may allow you to be socially active and interact with your neighbors, and that also is linked to health and well-being. And then finally, there may just be this direct effect on stress and also cognitive function, where just being in a green space allows you to reduce your stress, restore your attention, and that has independent effects on health and well-being. Now, this is a state of the science talk, so I wanted to really drill a little deeper, and I'm sure a lot of you out there are skeptical. One of the hard things with nature is, what is nature? How do you measure exposure to nature, right? So first off, what is the amount of nature, right? Like, is it the quantity of vegetation in a census tract, right? And that's one way of thinking about it. There's also other aspects of it. So the condition or quality of that nature. Is there, diverse tree species or microbes in the soil, right? What about proximity or accessibility? Like, do you live within a 10-minute walk of a park? And is there a big gate around that park and it's private? How accessible is it for you? Another metric is, actual contact with nature. If you have GPS data on people spending time in green spaces. And then finally, perceptions or qualitative measures. So like, what is the beauty of the nature? What do you perceive? And this is, not an objective thing. So it's much trickier to measure. So these are like different constructs of how we understand nature exposure. But this is realistically how we measure nature exposure in observational studies. So most studies, we're kind of looking under the lamppost here. Most observational studies will primarily focus on residential address of study participants. That's what we have data on. So that's what we usually use. And then we link those residential addresses to data sources on nature. So those would be satellite imagery. So this is NDVI data, which I'll talk about in a second, but this is basically satellite taking an image of the Earth, and we get the quantity of vegetation in a given pixel. We also have data sets from aerial photography, land cover data sets, where they've segmented out each 30-meter pixel of the Earth's surface and said this is a tree, this is a impervious surface, etc. And then we have administrative data sets like parks, right? So this would be just a data set that this is the city of Pittsburgh or Allegheny County, where they're just talking about the city or the county would keep a record of where parks are, and so you could link that to the participant addresses. Just to put this all back together, thinking about geocoded residential addresses of participants, we overlay, this is that NDVI data, so this is satellite-based normalized difference vegetation index. And so the thing that we are really lucky is that back in the 80s, they started putting these satellites up into orbit. Every surface of the globe, we get an image of every single surface of the globe every 16 days, right? So we have really, really good time varying objective data on the Earth's surface. And specifically, we were able to look with this normalized difference vegetation index. We can look at this ratio of near infrared to visible light, and it just happens to be a really good metric of photosynthetic, vegetation. And so this is a really nice ratio that we can examine as just a pure quantity of vegetation at a ground level, right? So again, moving this to how do we actually operationalize this? We have a hypothetical address here of a participant, and we overlay that data, that NDVI data, right? And so we can extract, the pixel that participant lives in and say, what is the NDVI value for that pixel? And the NDVI goes from -1 to 1 with positive values. 1 is like pure vegetation, just tons of dense vegetation. And so we can extract the value for the pixel the participant lives in, or we can look at buffers. This is a little 1,200-meter buffer around the participant's home. And we can say, what's the average of all pixels in that area? And obviously, this is also time-varying data, so we can look at this over time. We can create cumulative average over a long time periods of their exposure to nature. And if they move, we can update that as well. So that's kind of a quick primer on how we develop exposure metrics for nature. Next, I'm going to walk us through what is the evidence on nature and different health outcomes. And to start this, a little over a year ago, I was asked to be part of the first ever National Nature Assessment and the chapter on health and well-being. This was sponsored by the U.S. Global Change Research Program. However, in January 30th, 2025, the Trump administration killed this program. This was going to be, the first ever National Nature Assessment, looking at all sorts of, economic benefits of nature, health benefits of nature. So it was killed by the Trump administration, but thankfully, other funders have come through, and we are having this effort still go forward with private funding. So that's really exciting. So if you're interested, you can check out United by Nature, and you can see the website here. We are unitedbynature.org. Because we're no longer funded by the government, we have a much glossier website, so that's fun. But what I'll be reporting on is not necessarily what the findings of this report are, but it's informed by some of the work I've done with this, stellar group of researchers on nature and health in this health and well-being chapter. So there is growing scientific evidence for the health benefits of nature and many different health outcomes. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to try and take us through a few examples, a few kind of overviews of different health outcomes. But this is not meant to be comprehensive. This is more meant to be just a nice little sprinkling of evidence here, and hopefully you'll have some interesting questions at the end. But it's not meant to be comprehensive. Just to put that out there. First of all, this is kind of one of the longest running outcomes that's been focused on with nature and health, and that's all-cause mortality. It's one of the things that actually got me into this field in around 2016 when we published this paper on Greenspace and all-cause mortality in the nurses' health study. Here we looked at NDVI, again, that vegetation index, and we looked at, the 250 meter around the participant's home from 2000 to 2008. We binned our participants into quintiles of their Greenspace exposure, and we found that participants in this top quintile, the top 20th percentile of Greenspace, had about a 12% lower mortality rate compared to the lowest quintile over follow-up. And that is adjusting for many factors, including census tract median home value and income, right? And we did some other sophisticated things, mediation analysis. It was accounted for lots of other factors, very robust, and seemingly consistent with the literature. And since then, there have been many other papers published on this topic, including studies, in Canada with like 1.2 million people, and in Switzerland. Maybe this one's in Switzerland with 4 million people. And you can see this meta-analysis where, ours was the strongest effect size, but, fairly consistent here with the, this pooled hazard ratio of about 0.96 for I forget what the increment is there, quartile increase, but fairly consistent across lots of different studies with many, many, many people where there is this protective association between Greenspace and mortality. Our group has also published on depression incidence, and there's a good number of studies out there on depression and anxiety and how Greenspace seems to protect against depression and anxiety. We also found I think it was about a 13% lower incidence of depression in the nurses' health study with a higher level of Greenspace. And here we also kind of threw the kitchen sink at it with every single covariate we could think to adjust for here. Now, I have to point out this study because I really think it's very compelling. This is a study in Denmark where they have medical records on every citizen across the entire country. And so what they did is they looked at all the residents of Denmark from birth to age 10 in a given time period, and then they followed those participants up to 30 years later. And they said, is Greenspace exposure associated with the risk of adult psychiatric disorders? And so this is a little flip to saying low Greenspace associated with higher risk of psychiatric disorders. And basically, across every single psychiatric disorder they measured, except for intellectual disability, they found that higher Greenspace was related to lower incidence of these psychiatric outcomes. And this is consistent after adjusting for urbanization, socioeconomic factors, parental history of mental illness, and parental age. They even stratified by, urbanicity, and they found that this was consistent in rural areas, and it was consistent in urban areas as well. So some pretty compelling evidence there. Now I'm just going to kind of take us quickly through a few other outcomes. So mental health, there are many studies showing that nature exposure is also associated with lower levels of stress, lower levels of loneliness. In children, there's growing evidence that higher nature exposure is associated with fewer behavioral problems, and also lower ADHD and anxiety in children. So some interesting growing evidence there. For health behaviors, there's consistent evidence that living in a greener area is associated with higher physical activity and robust to adjustment for a lot of factors, but there's really not so many prospective studies there. So perhaps more research is needed. There's some evidence of a negative association between greenness and overweight obesity, but findings are mixed there. So, that's one of the less strong findings. And then there's also, I would say, some good evidence that people living in greener areas get more sleep and perhaps better quality sleep, but this is a newer area of research. For chronic diseases, I mentioned mortality is kind of the most well-studied outcome there, but there is now emerging evidence that living in places with higher Greenspace is associated with lower incidence of diabetes, and also among diabetic participants, better glycemic control. And then, for cancer outcomes, this is a kind of a new area as well. There is some suggestion that living in areas with higher green space is associated with, lower prostate, lung, and breast cancer mortality, and potential beneficial association with the incidence of prostate, lung, and breast cancer. But again, this is very new work. And then there's very consistent evidence of lower incidence of cardiovascular disease in greener areas. And now I want to dive into a cool natural experiment. My colleague Jeffrey Donovan at the U.S. Forest Service um, stumbled upon this great natural experiment where this little guy, the emerald ash borer, this little bug, had come into the Midwest and killed off all sorts of trees in the area, right? And so there was an ongoing women's health initiative study to say, could I use this natural experiment? There's no socioeconomic gradient into what areas got hit with emerald ash borer. He just wanted to see, like, are these places with the emerald ash borer infestation doing better or worse with respect to cardiovascular disease, right? So you can see here, this is one community before the emerald ash borer hit. This is that same community after in Ohio. And what Jeff found is that living in a county infested with an emerald ash borer was associated with a 41% increased risk of cardiovascular disease. So it's a pretty compelling study, a natural experiment of how just killing off green space might have some impact on cardiovascular outcomes. There's also a lot of literature now on how nature exposures may influence Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, also Parkinson's. This is one study we did a few years back, looking at 62 million Medicare beneficiaries, where we looked at vegetation, again, this NDVI metric. We also looked at access to parks, and we also looked at blue space, which is access to water. We also, in this study, accounted for fine particulate matter, NO2, and also temperature, humidity, and precipitation. And this is not the best visual. I probably should make this slide a little clearer. But the main effect here is on the left-hand effect estimate. Basically, we found NDVI was associated with lower ADRD hospitalizations in this large study. And consistently, I think across NDVI, parks, and blue space, all of those exposures were associated with lower incidence of Parkinson's hospitalizations. So some pretty compelling findings there. And there's many other studies on Alzheimer's incidence. I'm just highlighting Joachim Klontmacher, one of our former postdocs, work on this study. Also, Marcia Pescador Jimenez, who's faculty at BU, led this study looking at greenness exposure in adulthood in the Nurses' Health Study participants, where we looked at cognitive decline, so the rates of cognitive decline. And we found that higher greenness was associated with slower cognitive aging. And 1 IQR higher greenness was associated with slowing cognitive aging by approximately 8 months here. And we have future studies, which I'll be talking about later, funded by the National Institute on Aging, where we are trying to look at other outcomes, looking at more cognitive decline metrics and looking at Alzheimer's, dementia, and even neuropathology data. So some really compelling work on green spaces and health with respect to aging. The other end of the spectrum is birth outcomes. There's very consistent evidence of a positive relationship between nature exposure and birth weight. So people living in greener areas tend to have larger babies, which is associated with a number of later health, positive health outcomes later in life for those children. And these findings are stronger among low socioeconomic status mothers. I'll note that findings for other birth and developmental outcomes like preterm birth or small gestational age, infant mortality, are inconsistent at best, and so they require more evidence. Another area that certainly requires more evidence is asthma and allergies. So there is, I'd say, unclear and mixed findings here, where some studies find that living in a greener area is associated with higher risk of wheezing, bronchitis, and asthma. And other studies find that actually living in greener areas is associated with lower levels of asthma and allergy risk. And in fact, some studies, even within the same study, if they stratify by different regions of, for instance, Germany, they find that there's different risk in the north versus the south. So it's very confusing. And I think, we need more research there, perhaps more specific metrics of what exactly we're exposed to and the allergenicity of the plants. So for other outcomes, there's also emerging research on extreme heat and how green space interacts with the health effects of heat. I'm sure folks in this room are very familiar with some of this literature, but there's been an emerging set of studies that show that, for instance, cardiovascular mortality and heat, that relationship is attenuated in places with higher levels of green space. Um, there's also emerging research that greening interventions may lower rates of gun violence, which is a very, very intriguing, but I think nascent body of literature. There's also studies that show that greener places are associated with higher human microbial diversity. So the gut microbiome may be more diverse in greener areas. And then finally, there's studies that show that higher tree cover, for instance, is associated with lower levels of inflammatory biomarkers, which can impact lots of different health outcomes. Um, all right, so I actually want to spend a good portion of this talk now, and I'm glad I'm doing okay on time, because I want to talk about future directions in nature and health research, because I think this is the exciting part for me. Um, I talked about a lot of studies here, and I even see a question in the chat, and it's almost like the softball that was lobbed up for this. It's great. Um, there are some limitations on this research, right? So we talk about, is greenness around the home? Are we talking? Is that the right measure at all? What area around the home should we be looking at? Are we capturing contact with nature, or is this just some coarse proxy, right? And then we focus on vegetation, right? But does the quality or type of green space matter, right? What are the specific active ingredients in nature? And this is really relevant for, if you're taking causal inference, this is this idea of consistency. If we are proposing an intervention that is increased NDVI by 0.1, but that can be done in 100 different ways, that has some causal inference implications. It also has implications for policy, right? How do we tell a policymaker, hey, increase NDVI in your city? Well, they can do that 100 different ways. So we need to be more specific in our metrics and understand really what is the specific type of exposure that influences health. So getting at the first point, we are incorporating smartphone applications and wearable sensors into some of our work to get better at location data, so higher granularity on actually where people spend time. This is my data when I used to live in Cambridge, and this is every 15 minutes pinging from a smartphone app that we use to get location data over time. We also incorporate wearable sensors like the Fitbit to understand objective steps, heart rate, and sleep at the minute level. And coupling this all together allows us to get really granular data on health behaviors, mental health, cognitive function. So this is like a little example of kind of putting this all together. You can have your GPS data, you can have your activity level linked to that, and you could overlay that with NDVI, for instance, and say, is this person more likely to be active in a green space versus not? We also incorporate ecological momentary assessment and ask people questions occasionally. And so we have these time-stamped geotagged things on, emotion, mood, et cetera, so we can see how that's linked to location. We now, from NIA, have this newly funded study where we're actually attempting to incorporate remote assessment of cognition through smartphone apps as well. So we're using the Ambulatory Research in Cognition platform from WashU and my colleague Jason Hassenstab, where it's validated cognitive testing on your phone. It takes 2 minutes or less to go through some of these cognitive tests. And again, they're all timestamped and geotagged. So we can actually measure repeated cognitive function in location, and we can link that to different types of green space exposures and say, in the moment where you were, is that associated with your health or your cognition, or is exposure to green space in the hour or the 24 hours prior associated with your cognition? So a lot of great work there, funded by NIA just this month. So really excited to move forward on that. Next is exposure assessment through deep learning. So there's a question about, does the quality or type of green space matter? We are trying to improve the granularity there, and we're using deep learning algorithms like PSPNet here, applied to Google Street View images. So we've downloaded 350 million Google Street View images across the entire US. For each one of those locations, we are segmenting them. So we're basically using these algorithms that say, this pixel is a tree, this pixel is grass, this pixel is a flower. And then we can create these surfaces. So the surfaces now look like this, where we have, for every city in the US, we've created these surfaces, which now this is no longer NDVI, it's not vegetation, but it's actually grass. So percentage of grass within view, percentage of trees within view, and percentage of other green, which is basically plants, flowers, and fields. It's basically ornamental vegetation like shrubs. So we can see how these exposures now, instead of NDVI, may be related to different health outcomes. So adding that specificity, that granularity. So this is what it looks like in the Nurse Society Health Study. Some examples of the distribution of different quartiles. So like this is quartiles of trees, and you can see the green highlighting from the algorithm that tells you where the trees are. This is grass, and this is other green. This is not published yet, but hopefully will be accepted soon, where we're finding that actually trees are associated with reduced incidence of cardiovascular disease, while grass and other green is associated with increased incidence of cardiovascular disease. So we are seeing this kind of difference between these different metrics of nature. So lots to think about there. We're also getting, with our colleague Andrew Larkin and Perry Highstead at Oregon State, we've developed new algorithms to take street view imagery, have participants judge many, many, many different images based on subjective metrics. So is the street safer for walking? Is this more beautiful? Does this feel like higher quality green space? So these subjective measures of built environment quality. We put that through computer vision models and have built out this prediction surface. So basically applied it to all the rest of the street view images that we have and created a surface on built environment perceptions. And we're now using that data to see if we can predict health from those perception data. So a few closing notes. I have about 10 minutes left, so that's great. First off, and maybe this goes without saying, but there are massive disparities in who has access to green space in this country. A while back, Joan Casey and I did an analysis of all urban areas in the US, looking at all the census block groups in the US, and looking at vegetation data. And we found, if you can follow this figure, this is the NDVI on the x-axis, and this is the average neighborhood racial composition on the y-axis. And you can see the different races that are captured by the US Census. And you can see that greenest areas in the country are predominantly made up of white residents, while in the lowest green space areas, these are much more diverse, right? So there's massive exposure disparities. We also looked at this from 2000 to 2011, and these disparities persisted over that decade. So this could possibly contribute to health disparities by race and socioeconomic status. Also worth pointing out, there's this seminal study back in 2008 in the UK where Mitchell and Popham looked at disparities in cardiovascular disease by income. So this is showing you disparities in cardiovascular disease by income, which this is the lowest income group in pink. And they basically found that the gap between the wealthy and the poor for cardiovascular disease was narrowest in the greenest communities, right? So this idea that there's actually less of a disparity, this narrowing of the gap between the wealth and the poor is evident as the equigenesis hypothesis, the idea that green spaces make people more equal with respect to health. And people are exploring that as well. There's also ongoing and maybe stalled, but there was $1.5 billion from the USDA funded through the Inflation Reduction Act for urban and community forestry grants across the US in only disadvantaged communities, right? So it's unclear how much of these funds are actually going to flow to these communities now, but there is still, funding and opportunities to study these types of interventions. So can we study the health effects of these natural experiments? And I say natural in two ways there, but we are planting trees in these communities. Can we study, before and after? And folks like, Ray Yeager and Rooney Butnagar in the University of Louisville are already doing this type of work. Folks in Philadelphia are also doing this type of work, but there's going to be lots more opportunities to study this going forward. A little note of caution also, green gentrification is something we do have to consider. Lots of greening projects may overlook or minimize negative impacts for socially vulnerable communities. And your really low-income communities and people of color have contributed the least to climate change, are the most exposed to climate hazards, and have the fewest resources to adapt, but are the most likely to be displaced during these big greening projects. So, my colleague Isabel Angelowski in Barcelona has really studied this at length, but how do we improve green spaces without displacing communities is something we really need to think about. And maybe that's, not building massive or new urban parks, but instead smaller parks and communicating with current residents to see what they actually want, rather than just paternalistic coming down and telling them what they need. And then the climate crisis. Perhaps I'm preaching to the choir here, but green spaces have massive co-benefits for human health and the health of natural systems. So major carbon sink, maybe again goes without saying, but green spaces prevent soil erosion, provide substantial cooling in urban environments. They also may impact equity, right? So low income blocks have less tree cover and are much hotter during extreme heat events than high income blocks. So really, this is just to say that nature-based solutions may be a great tool to address both climate and health. And so we should really think about them that way. Um, and then, I'm sure a lot of you are thinking this, there's tons of unanswered questions in this field. I've been talking about vegetation basically the whole time. So, first off, even within vegetation, allergenicity, right? Do we know about plant species? That those data sets are harder to come by, right? There's also biodiversity, right? Maybe the biodiversity of the microbes, biodiversity of the plants, maybe fauna. Who knows? There's lots of things that could be at play here that we're not really measuring. And then there's smells, sounds, other pathways through which nature could impact health. There's studies on bird songs and how that's related to better mental health. There's BVOCs, or biogenic volatile organic compounds, the things we smell, the chemicals that come off of trees. Those things may be impacting our health as well. And that may be a relevant mechanism, but it's not something that we commonly measure. I'll give a shout out to my colleague, Greg Bratman at University of Washington. He's taking students out, putting them in these space helmets and randomizing who has a filter so they can't breathe in the natural air. They're breathing in filtered air. Others can hear the bird songs and hear nature, and others can't. And so he's trying to get at what are these kind of relevant, again, acute data here on acute outcomes. Well, what are these relevant exposures in nature? Is it the sound? Is it the smell? Is it just viewing nature? So there's a lot of different things at play here that a lot of smart folks are trying to work on. I'm sure many of you also are thinking about non-green nature. And this paper by Lee et al., you can look that one up, is about what about non-green spaces, right? And so I have very briefly talked about blue spaces, water, but there's a whole, teams of researchers looking at blue space and how living near water may be beneficial for health. There's also brown spaces, deserts and other non-green areas that might be beautiful and might be a place that you can be physically active in, but aren't green, right? So that might benefit health too. White spaces, snow, and all sorts of aspects of snow that might be beneficial for health and might be recreational opportunities. And then other things like mountains and sunsets, right? Things that are much harder for us to measure. There's just a lot of complexity here. So we need to acknowledge that. And we certainly do in my field, is that we know we're not measuring everything, and we know there's a lot of complexity and there's more work that needs to be done. But it's kind of still, I think, the dawn of this field of really taking nature and health seriously and diving deeper. So with that, I'm just going to conclude. I think there's long running interest in how we as humans interact with nature and how it impacts us. And nature may positively impact health, but more research is definitely required. And I really think this research can provide relevant and actionable information for planners, policymakers, community members, to design communities that are optimal and equitable for health and help us address the climate crisis. And I'll end with just thanks to a lot of my collaborators here, a lot of them from Harvard and BU. And also to funding, to NIA for funding our new RF1. So really excited for that. And I'm open to questions and comments. And if you want to reach out to collaborate, I'm also available. So my email's there, and I look forward to the questions.
Thanks, Peter. This was awesome. I learned a ton. Really exciting new stuff going on with your group too. Thanks for telling us about that. I think there have been some great questions coming in the chat, and actually, I think a lot of them you may have answered along the way after they were posted. So some of them you may not have anything more to add, but I'll ask some of them anyway in
Yeah.
case you did want to say anything more about some of these questions. I think you did talk a good bit about the quality or type of greenness and some of your new work on that. That's if I understand correctly, suggesting that maybe trees more than other types of green space are the driver. Is that am I understanding that
Uh,
correctly? And that was a question
So yeah, so
from Janine.
so caveat there. Yes, in that cardiovascular analysis, we are finding that trees matter more. And in fact, in a few other analyses, we do seem to see trees pop out more. And actually grass generally associated with worse health outcomes. But I will say it depends on the outcome, right? So these pathways may be different. And, I think I'm trying to remember, I think we have a paper in Mesa looking at maybe dementia, and we're seeing that other green is, I think, protective, but trees and grass are
Wow.
not. So it may really depend on the outcome. It may be residual confounding. Maybe there may be a lot of things going on there. And so we need to dig a little deeper. But this is kind of our first step in saying, can we disentangle just this monolith greenness and get at what the specific exposures are? And so definitely more work is needed there.
Yeah, fascinating. Um, this question, I think you also got a little bit at towards the end, but Justine asks, are the green space effects modified by other aspects of environment or climate?
Yeah.
And are there ways to modify the measures to account for this?
Yeah. So definitely, I mean, we do a lot of work stratifying analyses by region, for instance, or like eco region. But again, I think what we're trying to get at there is really what is actually on the ground. So I think we can certainly run stratified analyses. Oh, do we see something different? And then we can speculate as to why that's different, right? Yeah. Oh, the vegetation in Reno is super different because it's, cacti or something, but we actually would do better just to go and measure what actually is going on there, I think. So we're working, I had dinner with my colleague who's in plant sciences at UC Davis. We're trying to get better measures of actually what's on the ground rather than do more kind of coursework and speculate.
Yeah, really cool. Um, I think there have been a few other questions as well about measurement of green space. Maybe I could, since you're already on that topic, it might be worth asking a few of those now. So I see a good question from Ebru. Um, could you share your thoughts on implications of using
Mhm.
annual average NDVI versus seasonal
Yeah.
NDVI in green space health impacts assessments, especially in
Mhm.
light of your study on all-cause mortality?
Yeah. So, I mean, to be honest, it really probably doesn't matter too much because most people generally would rank similarly on either measure, right? And that's one of the things that we try and look at different buffer sizes. We try and look at different time windows of exposure. Um, for the most part, these things are not that sensitive because people don't change their exposure that much, or green spaces don't change within an area that much over time, right? I mean, again, I think it really depends on the outcome, and we've got studies where we look at, like, for instance, time window of exposure during your life course. So if it's like early life, or maybe mid childhood exposures, that might matter, the timing. But an annual versus seasonal NDVI, I'm going to guess that it's not going to impact too much. It may be like if you're in the Northeast, there's more variability than if you're in the Southwest, but I don't think it's going to change your exposure too much. So, what we always say is, let's look at it both ways. All right, let's look at it multiple ways and see if it impacts our findings. And I'd say usually it doesn't matter that much.
Makes sense.
And
Um,
yes, the slides will be shared. I think we should have said that ahead of time. Yeah.
yeah. Another question on measurement is from Marie. Is there a way to convert NDVI measures into percent canopy cover or at least percent
Yeah.
vegetation cover? The goal would be to set
Yeah.
targets based on evidence for municipal policymakers and practitioners.
Yeah. I think there's, arguably, I'm not exactly sure the right answer, but I know that people have tried to do things like this, and it may not be consistent from location to location, and that's why they've gotten away from it. So, like NDVI in a place that's similar to another place, but just as different on trees, that would be fine. But if you have like agricultural areas compared to urban areas, then that conversion isn't going to work so well. So I think that's why people kind of worry about those straight up conversion factors.
Yeah, makes sense.
And there are, I should just say, there are percent canopy cover metrics that are now nationwide, and they're increasingly available over time. That's kind of the big thing for us, is that we wanted data that goes back in time for many years. A lot of these metrics, like, oh, we've come up with this new cool thing, it's available for today, right? We're like, that's great, but we have a prospective study that started 20 years ago. So that's why that's why a lot of people have leaned on NDVI. But in the future, we'll be able to use other types of metrics.
Yeah, really cool. Yeah, I'm super excited about all the mobility based metrics that you talked about in your slides.
Yeah.
Um, let's see. Prashant asks, is there a threshold area of green space that's related to substantial health benefits? So I think that is
Yeah.
asking if
Is
there are some kind of boundaries
yeah.
beyond which it doesn't work anymore.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think if I'm reading that question correctly, I mean, there's maybe two aspects of it. First is we do usually get like we do nonlinear analyses, right? So we basically say, is there a point at which increasing green space doesn't matter anymore? And I think this is, relevant also that maybe there's people thinking about this, like, what about like rural areas, right? For the most part, a lot of our participants, like 80 something percent of our participants in studies I work with, are urban, much like the rest of the US. So most of the data comes from urban areas. And I think when you stratify by urban versus rural, you see smaller to no effects in rural areas, which I think speaks to this idea that once once you live in a forest, adding another tree is not going to make much of a difference, right? And I think you get most of the moving of the needle is when you have like an urban area and you're adding more vegetation to it, right? So if that's what you mean by threshold, I think there's that. But there's also this idea of like buffers, right? Like what is the optimal buffer size? And we have a paper that should be accepted any day now where we did. I think that in the end it was called rings, but like we call them donuts, concentric donuts, right? At first, adding, and this is actually with Donna Spiegelman, who's at Yale now, but what is the additional information gained from each additional donut going out? And we found again that most of the information was in this like immediate like 90 meters around the home. And this just maybe because it's correlated. Green space is not like plopped down in like little chunks, right? It's like you'd expect it to be pretty consistently green if you live in a pretty green area right around your home, right? And so we found that really there isn't necessarily a lot of benefit more to measuring bigger and bigger buffer sizes. Again, this is may just be spatial autocorrelation, but it is most relevant in the area like closer to your home. Yeah, and then there's a question with the 330-300 rule, which is I'm going to forget it off the top of my head. You should have 3 trees within view from your home. You should have like a I don't know 30% tree canopy cover and like 300 yard meters to a park. Is that right? I forget. It's something like that. I've actually published with that group on this. I think it sounds like a great idea. I mean, it's more of like a nice and easy thing to say. That's why they picked it, not necessarily purely empirical. But this idea of a 330-300 rule is something that we have to operationalize. So can we create metrics that are actually, can you see 3 trees from your house? Like, that's pretty tricky to do, but maybe we can come up with some proxies for that. And I don't think it's a bad goal to shoot for. It's something that's this is more about translation into action, right? It's something that you can communicate to a policymaker, and it sounds really tangible and doable. And so I think that's certainly something to shoot for.
Yeah, I hadn't heard about that rule, but super
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah,
It does sound catchy.
yeah.
So, related to thresholds, I guess we talked about space thresholds. Elaine kind of has a question about time thresholds, asking, does the time span of exposure to green space impact health differently? Is there some sort of minimum time threshold to have a positive impact?
So I'm not sure if that question, Elaine, is at like how many hours a week you need to spend in nature. Is that what you're getting at? Or is it like how many years do you have to live in a green space? Let me see if there's a okay, great, well, easy. So I think first off, for the time, there is a study that was very much picked up by the press based on like self-reported health and report self, cross-sectional self-reported health and self-reported time spent in nature, where they found 120 minutes a week was the optimal time, and anything beyond that, it just didn't give you any additional benefit. Now, it's not the best designed study, but it's easy to again digest, right? So I wouldn't really say that we have that much data on how much is enough time to spend in nature to have a maximal health benefit, or even to live in nature to have a maximal health benefit. And I think the right answer is that it probably depends on so many things. Right? It depends on the outcome. It depends also on the nature, right? Like, so if I'm looking at a house plant, is that enough? Or is it, do I need to be, spending time in Yosemite, right? Or Yellowstone or wherever, right? So like there's so much complexity. And I think also, you know, this may speak to this idea of, and I had a slide, but I pulled it, of the different experiences we can have in nature, right? And the time, like the frequency, duration, and type, right? Where you could go on a 2 week, wilderness adventure when you're a teenager, and it could be so formative on you that you change the direction of your life, right? Like, I mean, this does happen. There are these like Knowles and all these other programs, right, that get kids out into nature, and people speak very highly of them. Now, I don't know. I don't think we've designed studies to look at that, right? It's tricky, but usually we're studying these, more of kind of a longer term exposure and outcome, and not evaluating interventions like that. But there certainly are people out there who are looking into that type of data. So,
Yeah, makes sense. I think this is kind of related to your question about, or to your comment about quality. Kai asks, I have pretty substantial green space outside my apartment, but it's often filled with trash and many cars rushing by. So does it confer the same benefit? And
yeah,
I think
yeah.
you talked a little bit already about kind of how environment might modify effects of green space, but I'm curious if anybody has actually researched this type of feature in urban green space, where it might be you might have things that are green but also have a lot of cars nearby.
Yeah. Yeah. So this speaks to the idea of the exposome, right? This interaction between different environmental factors, and it's certainly um, something that we want to consider, right? It's again, it's complex. Decreased benefit of green space in the presence of traffic, noise, air pollution, et cetera, or socioeconomic factors, right? There's so much complexity there, but nowadays we can actually measure a lot of those things, right? We maybe can't measure the trash, but we can measure the air pollution, the noise, the density, the socioeconomic factors, right? That might be proxies for a lot of these things. And so we're trying to bring it all together, right? And say, and even using like fancy methods like Bayesian kernel machine regression, right? Where we can look at adjusting, but also interactions, and look at all these relationships together. And they're basically mixture models that allow the information to kind of get in there and fight and see which ones are the biggest predictors, right? And I've had this conversation a lot. I think green space is super important. I think it's fundamental to us as human beings, but it is not enough to overcome everything else, right? Like everything, it all is important. And so it's not just a panacea that you do this one thing, we're good. But it's part of the toolkit, and it should be considered seriously because it's something that I think we need. But it is not only, right. It's not sufficient, but it is necessary. So
Right. Makes sense. I actually had another question related to kind of potential effect modifiers.
mhm.
You mentioned that green space could help to mitigate adverse health impacts of climate change,
Mhm.
but kind of on the converse, could climate change actually also mitigate the
Yeah,
positive health impacts of green space? I think about
yeah,
this, about how now when I go out into green space, I'm thinking, did I get ticks? Did I get,
yeah.
and so I'm curious if there's any research yet on that topic.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of research on like stress on plants and animals with climate change and how this will affect. I mean, obviously, there's also the other side of like wildfires, and understanding that kind of dynamic. So I think there's certainly a lot of research into the give and take there, this kind of reciprocal relationship we have with nature and how we are impacting the climate. It may, also, like, for instance, heat. Like, sure, it's probably cooler slightly in places with vegetation, but if it's so hot that it may be different by 1 degree, but that it's still super, super hot and stresses us, nature can't overcome all of these things. So I think that there's certainly a lot of thought about this kind of back and forth, how we're impacting nature. And there's a lot of talk, especially about the kind of that. Now I'm forgetting the term, the wildlife urban interface of for like thinking about wildfires and tree, forest management, stuff like that, where we are certainly wanting to be in nature, but also in an arid climate that has intermittent fires. What is the right balance
Mhm.
there?
Right. How close
Yeah,
to nature should we really be? Yeah.
exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So
Yeah, it's a yeah, great thought. Okay, maybe one more question since we're nearing the end of time. I think this is a nice question from Anupama to end on. They say, can you speak more to how this research is informing policy and practice in communities and
yeah.
jurisdictions and how it can help inform guidelines, funding, et cetera?
Yeah. So, I mean, we are increasingly working with communities to try and incorporate this type of, research, and also to work with communities to gather more data. So, we have, hopefully we'll see if it gets funded, but we have some relationships with groups like Rise South City and South San Francisco where they're planting trees. And we're hoping to, have this kind of give and take where we can do measurement in their neighborhoods to understand noise, air pollution, temperatures, et cetera, and also access to green space, and then see how those things might change after a tree planting intervention, not to mention health outcomes pre and post tree planting intervention. Now, these are small scale. It'll be, unclear whether we can measure, like, I'm not saying planting a tree in front of your house changes your, blood pressure overnight, right? These things might be hard to measure, but I think those types of relationships, like, people are already doing some of this work, and these communities are very interested in this type of research. Um, so I think there's a lot out there that, like, for other reasons they're planting trees, right? For a lot of climate related reasons they're planting trees. They're not necessarily thinking about health. And so I think some of this research is starting to trickle down to those communities and to policymakers. And I know certain jurisdictions take this work really seriously, others maybe not. And I think that's the important role we have to play as researchers, is to make it not fringe, make it not a perk that the wealthy can have, but something that we see as like kind of a core part of our infrastructure. So something that you budget as a city to maintain the trees. It's not, oh, we want a beautification thing. It's like, oh, this is like a fundamental service that we need. And cities like Cambridge and Davis take this really seriously. But other, lower income communities might say, well, this is not a priority for us. We have a lot of other things. And so I think, if we can make the case that, well, actually, it also is something that benefits health of your residents, and maybe it should be, also taken into account. I think that's the hard part, is like, people are like, yeah, sure, I get it. Trees are good. But if we can quantify the health benefits of this type of exposure, I think it makes it a lot more tangible and real. So I think that's one of my goals.
I think that's a great point to end on, and will motivate us all to go out and continue the work in this space. So thank you so much, Peter. This was fantastic. I learned so much, and thanks to everybody online who was submitting super thoughtful questions. This was a great discussion. So thanks, everybody. And the slides and video will be available on our website here in the next week or two. Okay,
Thanks so
thanks.
much. Bye.
Bye, everyone.